It's 90 degrees out today, so I thought for this one I'd run streetcars in the snow. This is how Twin City Rapid Transit managed to run a streetcar system in the snowy weather of Minnesota, and it was a learning process. This is some graphics from one of the ads. Now, the thing about the streetcar system is that under their franchises with the city of Minneapolis and St. Paul, they were required to plow the streets that they ran on. And so this shows one of their big plows with a wing out running down the street. Now, they did this for no additional compensation. This was part of the price of having a streetcar franchise. Now, things started out, of course, the system was horse drawn streetcars. And this is a horse drawn streetcar plow. And the way this worked is they didn't push it, they pulled it. The horse was actually harnessed to the front of it. And you can see they got blades on here. And then there was a guy who had controls to lower and maneuver the blades. And with the horse cars, this is how they would clear the line. Now, when the early electric cars came along, they didn't know anything different. And so here's a picture of one of the horse car plows, both being pulled and pushed by a streetcar. These early streetcars didn't have a whole lot of traction. And we have newspaper accounts of something like 8 or 9 of these things all tied together, pushing and ramming a plow into the snow. Not necessarily the most effective way to get the job done. So they started experimenting. And their second generation of plows, which they built in their own shops in the 1890s, all looked like this. I don't know, there are probably 7 or 8 of them or so. And you can see it's actually got a wooden plow blade. And I believe what's happening here, it's got a wing plow. And I think what's happening here is that this streetcar is actually pushing it. Because I can tell you these particular trucks and motors weren't very powerful and only had one powered axle, so they probably slipped a lot. This is about 1905. Now, about that time, they came up with this monstrosity that they called Jumbo. They built this in their shops and they called it a conveyor plow. And it would go through the snow, and the snow would go up this conveyor and be shot out the side, as well as having wings. This thing had something like 7 motors on it. And the reason there are 2 trolley poles is that it needed extra electricity simply to run all those motors. So this was a one-off. They built it. It apparently worked, but I think it was kind of complicated and not the most effective thing. So they came up with this, and they built a bunch of these plows. And this, when they built them originally, they had a plow on one end, and they had what they called a sweeper on the other. And this was a rotating brush that would brush away the snow. And so, depending on which direction you ran it, you either got a brush or a plow. Now, later, after about World War II, maybe it was about the late 30s, they took the brushes off and just made them straight plows.
I would think the brush would get down into the flanges better than the plow would.
Well, you would think so, yet they stopped using them. And so each plow had a 3-person crew, and you had a motorman who ran it and maneuvered the front plow. You had what you called the wingman, whose job it was to move this wing plow in and out. You didn't want to hit parked cars, but this one would reach all the way to the curb. And then you had a helper who was kind of along to help shovel, replenish salt, sand, etc. So this is a crew ready to go out. This is actually a St. Paul newspaper photo, ready to go out of the snowing shops and do some plowing. Here's that same crew in the plow. And so you can see the motorman at the controls. This is the wingman. And the plow would go out apparently with hydraulic power, electrical power, something like that, but he would pull it in. And this is salt in a bin. You had sand in a bin. And this is actually the control here for the wing plow. And this is from the article that accompanied that. And what would happen, of course, is that the streets would get narrower because of the snow, and cars would encroach on the streetcar tracks. And so something like 100 times in the course of their shift, they would, what they called bouncing a car. They would go and dig away the windrow from the curbside. And then old cars at the time had very loose suspensions, and they would bounce it up and down and bounce the car over a foot or two, so that it would get out of the way of the streetcar, because there were just endless incidents of these cars encroaching too much on the tracks and blocking the streetcar line. It was sort of like the biggest winter complaint that the streetcar company had. And here's a plow out, and it's leading a bunch of streetcars. This happens to be Como Avenue, just east of Western Avenue in St. Paul. Now, plowing wasn't the only way they handled snow. This is a sand car, and every one of their streetcar barns had a sand car. And it would distribute sand and salt. It would pour it on the tracks, just kind of like you see it today. Then the streetcars themselves, the ones that ran out to White Bear and Excelsior, Stillwater, and Bayport, were equipped with plows because they were out not in streets. They were frequently out on their own private right-of-way, so they had these metal plows. And here's an Excelsior on Lake Avenue, and you can see a windrow where this guy is moving along, and you can see he's throwing off snow. You can also see that nothing else is moving on the street. The only plowing that's happening is with streetcars. Now, the streetcars themselves then had little plow blades, the ones that ran on the regular city streets, that would scrape. The other thing they had were air-operated sanders. And so this sander with compressed air would drop a sand on the rail in front of the wheels, so you would get some traction. And within the streetcar, underneath the sideways seating row on the right side of the car, behind the front platform, was a sand bin, and that's what fed those sanders. And where did you get the sand? Where did you get the sand? You got them from bins that were located at each end of the line, and also, of course, at the car houses. Now, it's the summertime, so he's just demonstrating. But yeah, you'd take a bucket and you'd load up your bin, and then you could sand away. Now, when you got in the car barns themselves, you couldn't really run plows through there. The tracks were full of streetcars, and so before you could get your streetcar out on the street, you had to get the tracks clear. And this is at Nicollet Station, 31st and Nicollet. And because the guy has a pickaxe, clearly what has happened is that you've got ice in the flangeways. And the flanges on the wheels were what guided the wheels. If ice built up in the flangeways, you could have a streetcar ride up on the ice and derail. So the first thing you had to do was to get the tracks clear and get the ice out of the flangeways. And that had to be done by hand. And if you had a really heavy snow, and this is Snelling Station, after a big blizzard, you had to shovel out the ends of the tracks by hand. Now, obviously, you were okay where the streetcars were parked along the lines. The snow couldn't get there because there was a streetcar in the way. But you had to get to the switches and get out to the street, and this is what it took. Here's at East Side Station, and this guy is cleaning out the flangeways. This gives you a little better look at it. And here we are out on the streets. Sometimes the plow couldn't get there. And I was going to say if there was a switch here, but no, there's not a switch here. So I'm just going to follow here with a bunch of scenes of them running in snow. This is out on the Robbinsdale line. And once again, big blizzard, open country. And it's not clear that this streetcar is going anywhere anytime soon. This is downtown Robbinsdale. Now, downtown Robbinsdale was kind of unique because there was only a single track. They meant to build two tracks and never got around to it. And the single track, rather than being centered in the street, was located in the northbound traffic lane, which meant that if you were headed southbound, you had to run in the northbound traffic lane against traffic, which led to situations like this. Probably cost somebody to go over and get a Schmitz beer in the bar. This is the turn loop on the Minneapolis campus of the intercampus line. And here you see you have a streetcar, and he's following a plow that's opening up the line. This is the other end of the intercampus line, a view taken by motorman Ed Nelson, who was working it. And it was somewhat unusual to have 3 streetcars at one time on the end of the line. They usually ran double headers for class break, and then I think this other guy is just late, and probably because of the snow.
I wonder if they had trouble with those gate cars, with the gates freezing or being clogged up with snow.
Yeah, I think the mechanism, because you can see the mechanism is dragging down in here. Now, of course, they work them constantly, so I'm thinking that maybe they didn't have a chance to block up. Here's just kind of typical running. This is Nicollet Avenue at 42nd Street. And here's out at Fort Snelling. This is what they called Bridge Junction. This is where the St. Paul and Minneapolis lines met. This was right in the middle of today's historic fort. Matter of fact, if you look over here, here's the Round Tower, which would have been out on the edge of the fort. And here's navigating some particularly slushy conditions at Seven Corners in St. Paul. And here's what happened with the front fender if you had too much snow. It would act as a snow accumulator, not a plow. And it was not uncommon in these situations for the streetcar crew just to take these things off and leave them by the side of the track and come back and get them later. This, I think, is Payne Avenue in St. Paul. And of course, automobiles were in the way. And so here you have people trying to get an automobile out of the way of a Selby Lake car on Selby Avenue. And of course, the more cars people bought, the more automobiles got in the way of the streetcars.
That's a great photo.
Yeah, here's a motorman who has, I think he had a shovel on the car, and so he's trying to get this guy out of his way. Downtown St. Paul, that would be East 7th Street, about Robert Street. Notice the Christmas decorations are up. Another view at Seven Corners. There's the cathedral in the background. Upper end of the Wabasha Street Bridge. And sometimes the plows themselves derailed. This is Randolph Street and the west of Snelling, and it has apparently run up on some ice in the flangeways, and the plow itself is derailed. Here's a bus that's in trouble. This is a Twin City Rapid Transit service truck that's come to rescue a bus. Now, normally the buses were able to handle the snow much better than the streetcars. And during the notorious Armistice Day blizzard in 1941, all kinds of streetcars were stranded and the passengers were offloaded onto buses and rescued. This is the Bottleneck by the Walker Arts Center. We're Hennepin and Lyndale Cross. This is the corner of Chicago Avenue going across and Franklin Avenue. And here you can see, the streetcars are all backed up. You got a big crowd of people who have been waiting for streetcars, waiting for something to come along. And so service was always badly disrupted when you had a snowstorm. This is Chicago Avenue at 17th. Once again, this car is just filled to the doors, and it's probably passing up most of these people. I think it looks like maybe they can get one on, but when you have a crowd like this, they've been there for a while. This is 42nd Avenue South, just south of Hiawatha, near Minnehaha Park. Once again, the flangeways are all screwed up, and they're trying to go and clear them out, and you can see you got to back up the streetcars. This is in front of Kaufman Union at the University of Minnesota. You're on one of the footbridges looking across the old Washington Avenue Bridge. And out here in the middle of the street are a whole bunch of university students trying to get back to downtown. And I think this is the last slide. This is Washington Avenue North This is the crossing of the railroad tracks at about 4th Avenue North, and here you can see a car that's spun out trying to get up this little hill.